Have you ever experienced a time when you really believed something, you thought you understood it, you thought you were already looking at it from all different angles, and then something happened in your life and you suddenly saw everything differently? Or I think in this case, it's as if I was been looking into a muddy pond or a muddy lake or a muddy ocean, and suddenly it's like I can see through clearly to the ocean floor. And so I want to share what happened and what I'm talking about and some of my personal takeaways. So this is about parenting in a time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've been speaking about this, I've been exploring it, I've talked about it in workshop sessions at the summer symposium, I've talked about it in video logs, I've done Self-Reg diaries with my daughter Sienna months ago, reflecting on it in all sorts of ways, and always trying to make sense of how we parent, how we human, how we take care of ourselves throughout this pandemic, and how Self-Reg can help with that, which it absolutely can. But something happened this past weekend, and I'm going to share a bit of the story with you here, that has really deepened my understanding. It's as if I suddenly see everything differently, and it's more like bringing I don't know if it's like bringing a camera image into focus, or looking at the bottom of an ocean floor and suddenly you see everything more clearly. And that's because of something that we lived through in this past weekend. So here's what happened, and I have 10 bits of advice at the end of this that I'm going to share with parents. Just my takeaways from what we experienced over the last 5 days. So last Friday, the very last day of the Self-Reg Summer Symposium, it was July 31st, and I was due to be part of a closing panel on that day at 1 o'clock. That included Stuart Shanker, Dr. Jerry Costa from Montclair University, and a friend and partner of ours, and the lovely Roberta from Nungi's First Nation. So those of you who've seen the video where Roberta teaches me about Self-Reg and hope, Roberta joined us for that. And I had to cancel at the last moment. It doesn't usually happen. And here's why. I got a call. My daughter had had a couple of days of a sore stomach, which I didn't really think was all that much of a big deal. She had gone the night before to her best friend. That's our bubble family. We've been very careful, and this has been the family that Sienna's been spending time with, and their daughter with ours, and trying to be balanced and yet careful and safe. So she was there the night before. It was her best friend's birthday on Friday, and I get a text from her in the morning that she was up all night, which is unusual. And I get a call a couple hours later, because at that point I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll have to go and get her, but no big deal, that she had a high fever. Long story short, we went in, we ended up in the hospital. So we went in, I was worried, of course, about COVID. She had all the symptoms, and went in, got a test in a drive-through, and they sent us, on a succession of steps, which very quickly, within about an hour, landed us in Emerge here in Peterborough. So there's a lot more to the story, and I'm going to share a little bit about it elsewhere, because Sienna has agreed to let me share some of the story so that we can help kids and children that end up in the Emerge sort of understanding from what that experience was like. But here's what I want to tell you as parents. What happened was a scare. It turned out to not be that, but it was very much a life-threatening scare that had us race that evening to Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, and we were in for 5 days and in isolation right up until yesterday. And the worry was that she had COVID, and she had what's called post-COVID here in Canada. It's called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in the US, and I think it's referred to as PIMS in the UK. It's what takes over a child's body, and inflammation takes over a child's body and is life-threatening. And they've connected it to COVID, and they don't understand it completely. Now, she didn't have that. And we were all tested, and we didn't have COVID. But here are my takeaways from someone who thought they were being very careful about this, being very balanced, who's also trying to consider how do we get back to school safely, which I'm going to talk about in a separate but linked video. How do we do this in a balanced way? How do we support our children, support our families? How do we support our educators from all of the different angles? Because what happened, it was scary. We were raced we were raced to Toronto. So you can imagine all of those things that go through your mind as a parent, as you have this huge team of people, telling you all, everything's okay. I mean, you're watching all of the monitors, and you realize there's something very serious going on. I can't compare it to anything else I've experienced as a parent. I mean, it was probably the scariest night of my parenting, perhaps save the very first day when she was born. But from that, in all of this period of unknown that began Saturday morning, you start to realize that, okay, you're bubbling, your bubble family, your 2 or 3 folks that you've been around, they've been around 2 or 3 folks. And they've been around 2 or 3 folks. And in fact, I had filmed last Friday. For the very first time, I had seen Aiden and Aaron, who were on the other end of this camera, since before the everything shut down. So all of a sudden, they're part of my bubble. And, my partner, Eric, had been, had taken his had gone to pick up my car at the hospital here in Peterborough, and had taken his son, who just has a newborn, and what it did for me, was realizing, first of all, that this is about keeping our kids safe. And I need you to hear that I am not going to advocate for completely closing and shutting down everything. I really don't think that that's the way we need to go. I think what we need to do is ask questions about the hows, and how do we get there, and how do we get there safely. But I also think there's an awful lot of things that we can do as parents, and a few that I had been doing in a certain way, I will never do that way again. And I'm going to share those with you, my takeaways, okay? So we're safe, we're okay. We came home last night, but we had a big scare that has changed my thinking. And here are some of the things I would like to share with you. These are in no particular order. I took these notes while I was in the hospital, doing lots of reflecting. So, number 1, it is a myth that children cannot get COVID. It is also a myth that they are always fine. It really is. We were suspected of having COVID, or she was, I wasn't at the time, although they were being vigilant and careful. And that was simply because they had test results that came back that I didn't. But she was suspected of it. Kids can get COVID. While we were in the hospital, I learned of a baby, an infant that had COVID in the same hospital. I did all kinds of searching. Kids can get COVID, and they can get very sick, okay? So as I share that, that's not meant to suggest we scare anybody. The opposite, and I'll have advice around that as well. But we cannot treat this as a myth that kids cannot get COVID, because it is a myth. They can get it. It's highly contagious, and they can. Okay? So that's the first one that I learned. My kiddo is not Teflon, and she might have more Teflon abilities than me at 52, but she's not Teflon, and none of our kids are. Okay? So that's number 1. Number 2, you can protect your family by doing things like hospitals do. So I was really, first of all, I was blown away by Sick Kids here in Canada, which is a world-class hospital for children in so many ways. And so thankful to be Canadian and to have this healthcare available to us and the teams of people that were involved. But I was also, watching how they approached everything. They were very cautious. So, there was all of the isolation bits, which reminded me of my mom when she had pneumonia, and she was in isolation at the time. So some of that was familiar to us from hospitals a few years ago. they took all of that care, but they also were actually very calm around it and not creating additional panic. It was balanced, creating safety. They had the shields and the PPE and this sort of thing, but there was also this calm around it. And so I learned a lot from the approach around it. And people were in and out the whole time, in and out. I mean, I think we saw 25 different specialists and doctors the first night we were there, that were, in and out of the room with tests and meeting and asking questions and these sorts of things. So they all did it carefully. And so I think that's an important thing, that as families we can think about, okay, how do we create safety and do really be smart around the things that we do, and with safety. We're not looking to create panic in our children, just good common sense around risk. And if you want to think about it, if you've got children that are going to be going on, playground equipment or a tall slide for the first time, or diving off a high diving board, anything that feels a little bit risky, these have risk, right? How would we prepare kids? Well, we want them to take, to feel safe, to take the risks, and we'll talk about that in a balanced way around education, and yet to do it as safely as they possibly can. And so that's the real key. The number 3 builds on that. PPE and masks in particular are here to stay, and they might be here to stay for 6 months. They might be here to stay for a lot longer. We just heard announcements in Canada. I heard yesterday that we should be prepared that this could be a couple of years. When we hear that, right, it makes our hearts sink in some ways. On the other end, I just, again, think staying balanced. We're trying to stay healthy, safe. We're paying attention to the science and the research and the scientists, and there is a collective wisdom around that. It is so easy for us to hear one neighbor and go down a path of misinformation and misunderstanding. And I think that this is no time for that. This is the time that we need to really pay attention. And if we're being overcautious, well, I would rather that than have all of you go through what I went through this weekend. So we need to normalize PPE. We need to, if you are in a place here in Ontario, they've just made it a requirement. You can't go in the store without it. It will be in schools if you're in a place where the kids are going back to school, and that is the case here in Ontario. PPE is part of it. And the more we normalize that and make it part of the routines now, the better. So if you don't like it, it makes me feel claustrophobic. I'm going to tell you that. I find the blue ones make me feel, as an asthmatic, anything that sort of affects my breathing does that. I'm not going to pass that on to my child. I'm going to try to find the cloth ones, the ones that make me feel okay about it. So we normalize it and we make it it's just a part of living right now. And it's about, an abundance of caution. And you wear a mask, right? It's the same as you wear a hat in the winter when it's cold. And so that sort of thinking, very calm, very balanced, and introducing it to children and teens now in any way that you can. If you have a child that's refusing, one of the most important things you can do is wear the mask yourself, okay? You're gifting to your child a sense that this is normal, this is healthy, this is okay, it's preventative, it is what we do and what we're doing now, so we can stay safe. Number 4, I've already touched on this idea of I have 2 friends and they have 2 friends, the old saying about how gossip can spread, or how about a secret can spread really, really quickly. What I encourage you to do is to give a moment's thought to this. I hadn't really, because I had been living in bubbles and have not come in contact with very many people, and I shop very little. I haven't seen Stuart in 6 months, for example, or any of our team members. And then all of the sudden last week, you begin to realize the ripple effects. And so it's just worth giving a bit of thought about, it can be communication plan, or it can be, we had to, for Sienna, on Friday, when they were first worried about this, I had to reach out to all sorts of folks that Sienna had been in contact with. And that created, best friends paused a canoe trip. And it created all sorts of ripple effects that in the end worked out just fine. But of course it brought our circle of panic much closer. So think about that through, and I encourage you to really consider that as well as we begin. Here in Ontario, everything in my part of Ontario, things have opened up. Our cases are very low, and the risk is much lower than in other places, but it's still there. And this is, as they told me in the hospital, it is a very, very contagious, and so we don't want to downplay that. So the next piece of advice I have is one that I learned the hard way. One of the first things my daughter said to me when she was told that they suspected COVID-19 and this multi-system, maybe as one of the possibilities, this post-COVID syndrome that affects children, teens her age, when the inflammation takes over your whole body. Her first response was she teared up and said, "Oh no, Mom, I'm going to make you sick." And so, where that came from. It came from the messaging that I gave her about how important it was that she take COVID-19 seriously. So it's very, because she could get it, and as a child, while she might not get sick, it would come into our family. And so it's the same sort of messaging that some of us have given our children about, not getting their grandparents sick. And I did it lovingly. I don't think I did it intending to cause guilt. But what I was trying to do was create enough of an emotion response, just enough, a little bit of fear. And I'm sorry to have to say that way. It feels awful as I say that out loud now, but that's what I was trying to do, trying to find a way for her to take this seriously. I didn't want her to, to come in contact with other folks. We have a big backyard, we have neighbors all over the place, to do things that might put us all in jeopardy. I wanted her to take it seriously. And yet, think about that from a Self-Reg lens, that's pro-social stress. So that's stress in the pro-social domain. The guilt she felt. So that's a really important thing that I want to speak about, is really thinking about the fear and the around whether there's a physical safety around this, but there's also all of the emotional safety, and there are all of the areas around that's where Self-Reg can help. So that's a very important one. If you have done that like I did, don't be hard on yourself. That was our strategy. That was something many of us were communicating to our kids. Lots of people are saying that to teens these days, so that they don't. Stuart wrote about the coronavirus parties in one of his blogs. So we're saying that to our young people. And I'm not necessarily saying that we don't want them to realize how contagious this is and they can pass it on. But we really don't want you don't want your child to say to you what mine said to me. And so it's also, the other piece of that is recognizing that children do get sick with coronavirus, so it's not all asymptomatic, and that's a myth that we have to bust. Look at the science. If you are convinced they are Teflon, they are not. They are in a lot better shape should they get the virus than a senior would be. But this virus can turn serious on all of us, and so we want to take it that way.